All right. Are we good on Zoom, Chantal? We good on Zoom? All right. Our next speaker is Dr. Brian Wooming.
Well, good afternoon, folks. Can everybody hear me just fine? So, I think I'm going to shift gears just a smidge and talk about what welfare means out in the field to us in specifically turkey production. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge that for Cargill, welfare really is a group affair, and there are several of us, most of whom are PACO certified, who work diligently to make sure that the standards that are put out by organizations such as the NTF are implemented uniformly across all of our 500 plus farms in multiple states. And I think what you're going to see as we go through my story is that there's a tremendous amount of focus on ensuring that uniform implementation. I spent a fair bit of time trying to figure out what I was going to talk about today. And I think what you're going to see is I picked some things where we had areas of improvement and change. And I also picked some areas that we still need to work on. And I'm going to try to give you just a flavor of the challenges that we encounter day to day. Realizing that things are not perfect and that we are in a constant state of change every day. Okay, so the first area that I'm going to look at are our breeders. Cargill has parent stock in multiple states, and there are certain unique challenges that come about with these birds. Certainly the size of the bird, our breeder toms can hit 75 pounds. And that leads to certain challenges when it comes to housing and caring for these birds. And I'll touch on this in just a little bit. Durability. How does this continually improving performance pressure impact the ability of these birds to walk, for example? And what are we doing? Third, I'll spend a little bit of time talking about beak conditioning and some of the things that we have changed. Okay, so this is a picture of one of our breeder tom facilities. And so these birds are kept in a pen. And I wanted to communicate or share some of the unique challenges with this. And certainly one is, as these birds get bigger, we have to make sure that they have adequate space for feed and water and to move around. And so we're constantly tinkering with ensuring that the feed containers that you see there, the troughs, that there's enough linear feet of accessibility for these birds, given the production demands on these facilities. As you can tell, I like to stroll around as I talk, so I'm going to have to monitor that. So this is an example of one of the potential problems we can see with durability. As we select for production improvements, there are times where we get hitchhikers that we unintentionally select for, things such as slight deviations in leg angulation, in this case, a valgus abnormality. The folks at the primary companies have gotten a lot better at minimizing the impact of this. One of the benefits to being an old guy, and I've been around since the 1990s, is that you have perspective. And I remember we would see more of this back then than we do now, which I think is speaks volumes about the attention that the geneticists have placed on getting their selective pressure just right and walking that line to where this is minimized. Some of it has to be that those of us in production are constantly alert to this, and we're giving feedback on an ongoing basis to minimize the impact that this may have out in the field. So that is an ongoing area of focus that we constantly look at out in the field. This is an area where I've seen change over the past 5 to 10 years. So what you're looking at are two birds. The one on the top has a beak that has either regrown or was poorly treated, to the extent that you have a beak that could potentially cause some problems if that bird decided to negatively interact with her companions, as compared to the bird at the middle bottom, where you can see that that tip has been treated such that it's harder for that bird to cannibalize another bird. Now, the reason to show this is, in the past, we would actually go into the field when these birds were older and touch up on that beak at the top. And that practice has been discontinued because it's very difficult to do that in such a way that minimizes the pain that bird might feel as we're treating it in the field for a second time. So we have moved away from that practice, and certainly the industry has moved away from that practice. It's one of those areas that over time we have changed. And we focus now on getting a better beak treatment in the hatchery, so that change is minimized, or that outcome at the top center is minimized. Culling and euthanasia are areas that we spend an awful lot of time focused on. We spend a fair bit of time working with our growers on what birds to cull. And given the difficulties we have currently with labor and finding folks that want to work in agriculture, that is an ongoing labor of love, I would say. We work with these folks on deciding who needs to be culled and when. And I included our own guidelines in terms of which birds will be euthanized. So in essence, birds that can't get the feed and water, and birds that cannot be reasonably expected to heal without unnecessary pain and distress. And then, of course, outlining the expectation that these birds need to be removed from the barn when they're observed during daily chores. But it's important to realize that there are a spectrum of individuals that either meet the criteria or will meet the criteria within days. And at the end of the day, it's a continual effort to train these individuals to make the correct decision. There we go. So I threw this slide in because as our big toms get bigger and our labor force gets older, it's harder and harder for growers to take these birds out of barns. And we've actually had to resort to, some growers have resorted to picking up pieces of equipment like this to help them get these birds safely out of the barn. It is sometimes hard to communicate to folks outside our industry just what it's like to walk through a barn of big toms. And I'm hoping this works. So these two of my colleagues in a barn of big toms. And I want you to imagine trying to pick up dead birds and take them out of a barn when this is going on around you. So I have spent several anxious moments when I'm trying to do something in a flock of big toms without getting knocked down by these birds, because they are fairly big and there's lots of them. So this is an ongoing challenge to figure out, how do we manage this process in an environment that's not always the easiest. Here's a bird that has some feather picking going on, and trying to decide at which point this bird needs to be removed from the barn or otherwise isolated. We have to give growers very general guidelines in terms of when they need to get these birds out. Or this scenario where we have an undersized bird. And I tried to get a good example. This one's a bit extreme, but obviously the bird on the right is an undersized bird in a flock of larger individuals. And we have to appreciate in production, is this an isolated event? Did this problem start when these birds were younger, which is what I'm trying to illustrate on the left? There are several reasons why an individual bird may be smaller than the rest of the flock. And trying to understand and appreciate when it becomes a welfare problem is not always easy to do. Is it an infectious problem? Is it a physiological problem? In other words, the bird may have an affected heart and have fallen behind. Is it an ambulatory problem? Or is it a bird that had a hard time starting and didn't keep up with its hatchmates? So many considerations could go into creating an uneven flock. How about this bird, where we're starting to see some cannibalism, starting to see some blood appearance? At what point does this bird then need to be isolated or removed from the barn? And it's trying to communicate that line to 500 plus growers so that they make the right decision. It's not always the easiest thing to do, and it's not always clear cut. But we definitely want to communicate there is a point where you have to act. And I think that's where my colleagues and I spend an awful lot of time. Now, this would be obvious. Okay, a bird that's been cannibalized and needs to be removed. Okay, the barn mates in this case will probably not leave this bird alone, and we have to communicate that expectation to our grower base. Okay, euthanasia. So this one keeps me up at night because it's there's nothing that is socially acceptable about euthanasia. It's a difficult subject that we have to deal with at the end of the day in production. We have to find the right equipment, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. I'm going to touch on some of the tools that we use for assisted blunt force trauma and some ideas that we're looking at. Touch a little bit on cervical dislocation, baby pulse, and having an excess supply. Think about high path AI going on right now. When farms are taken out of the process, we can't place birds onto those farms, but those poults are coming. They're coming whether we're ready or not. What do we do with them? There are situations outside our control. And then finally, disposal. Okay, so most of you, I think, have heard of the TED. Cargill was around when this one was designed and played a role in it. And at the time, it seemed to really help with our problems euthanizing big toms, other than using unassisted blunt force trauma. Over time, what we figured out is that it's not the most practical device to carry through a barn. And it's fairly difficult to keep this in working order. You have to really try to keep it working. There are two power sources, a battery and a gas canister. And having both of those always available is not the easiest thing on a farm. Finally, it's if you are hot challenged, like I am, it can sometimes be challenging to euthanize a bird with this device. So it works fairly well, but in practice, there are some issues. And so over time, we have spent a fair bit of energy trying to come up with alternatives, and I'm going to show you one in just a little bit. Cervical dislocation, which is the old standby, it's very interesting. As time has gone by, we have a grower base that looks like the rest of society. In other words, the boomers are retiring. And they can't handle birds, especially larger birds, easily. Interestingly enough, the generation that's replacing them isn't enthusiastic about this. And so we in production management have to come up with alternatives to offer clientele. Whoops. This is one example of a device that we are looking at right now. So I'm very passionate about giving a grower a device that's easy to carry in the barn. It's got to be portable, or they're not going to take it into the barn. And then it's much less useful if it's outside the barn in a fixed location. The other thing it's got to be is free of external powered sources. So it's got to be manual. And that way I don't have to worry about whether the battery was charged or whether the gas canister was leaking. And when I need it, it don't work. The folks at Keckner came up with this. We tried several different things, and this one seems to have some promise. There we go. So this one There we go. So this one requires turning the handle to cock the device. And I can just see the safety folks in Cargill rolling their eyeballs because we're going to get all sorts of wrist injuries doing this. And so this is one area we got to work on, is minimizing that turning, but realize that there's this trade-off. I've got to make it easy to turn so that an older person can actually do it, to compress that spring. And so it's, how many times do I need to turn to release the safety, which is one of those, and then actually fire the device. So this one, if I put a big enough spring in it, can euthanize a big tom, a 45 to 50 pound tom. And then if I want one for a hen, I can put a smaller spring, and I wouldn't have to turn as much. But that sort of initiative is going to help us to sort of accomplish what we want to accomplish. How do we cater to our grower base that needs something that is easy to manage, easy to clean, easy to fix, easy to operate, while at the same time meeting the welfare criteria? I need to be able to euthanize a big bird quickly and humanely, including those that have thickened scar tissue on their skull. And those are hard to do for any of you that have actually tried to do it. Those are not easy to do. So that one I'll probably work with Dr. Weimer on to make sure that it meets the euthanasia criteria in terms of its ability to humanely euthanize birds. So I threw this picture in because I wanted to touch a little bit on the situation that the industry finds itself in frequently, such as now, where we may have an outbreak of high-path AI, and all of a sudden we lose square footage. Think about this, guys. If there are 5 million toms that are put down because of high-path AI, that's a lot of square footage that's out of the system, and we can't put poults into those areas. So what do we do? What do we do with these poults, and how do we humanely euthanize them? They are tough questions that we have to deal with. So while that is not our standard operating procedure, as with some other industries, these are tough situations that will arise from time to time. And unfortunately, now it seems as though high-path AI is coming with alarming frequency. I never thought in my career that I would see high-path AI. It was a question on the board's exam that I took in the 1990s that I never thought I'd have to deal with. Never thought I'd see it in my career. And now I've dealt with it. This is my third go around, and it looks like I'm going to have to just learn how to live with it. So how do we deal with excess poults? Difficult, tough questions that I never thought we'd have to deal with. Disposal. We use a lot of composting. Getting this right. Okay. It works when it works, and it has to be done correctly. And that's something that those of us in operations management, it seems like such a simple thing, but getting it right across 500 plus farms is difficult. And so those of us that are on a day-to-day basis going and working with growers, encouraging, motivating, educating, how to do this right. It's interesting. We inherited a design for composting that ultimately turned out to not be the most user-friendly design. And so I'm talking about the little bays where you could compost birds. But in practice, it's not the easiest way to accomplish this. I'd rather have an open space. And so sometimes we're dealing with legacy infrastructure that turns out not to be as user-friendly as perhaps one might have expected. Pool treatments. We talked a little bit about beak treatments. This is an area where I think over time we've had some creativity, some initiative, and things are better today than they were when I first started out. And by that, I'm talking about the infrared treatments that we use currently. So the areas in white at the tips, those are treated toes. And after about 7 days, we lose the nail itself. It is a better alternative than when I started, where we would physically remove that toe. The dew claw, which in the old days, those would be taken off with a scissors. And now they're treated with infrared. So there has been an evolution over time to make this more of a humane, I think, intervention. And we continue to evolve in our thought process and which birds need this versus which ones don't. So for example, we don't do this with our toms, we do it with our hands. Live haul. This is very, very visible to the general public. And we spend a fair bit of time looking at this, trying to figure out how do we do this better. Equipment maintenance, labor, once again, and transportation. I'm going to touch on that just a smidge. So equipment maintenance, I think you saw the slide before where there were some cages, coops that needed repair. In this case, we've got a floorboard that needs to be fixed. So birds can't get trapped in there. That's something that's an ongoing concern and source of focus of attention. The actual process of loading, we spend a fair bit of time. For those of you who've never seen this, you can see this individual guiding that bird all the way into the coop and the pad to prevent the bird from hitting. So that's, most of us, I think, could get up there and have our 10 seconds of glory. Try doing that when it's -5. Or 105 for 8 hours straight, or even this morning when it was raining, right? It is very easy, I think, to come up with guidelines until you've got to get up there and do that. And that's what we spend a lot of time. How do we find that balance, doing this right and making sure that the people who actually do this stuff are safe, right? I'm always amazed when I go to see nighttime loading and how those guys can back those trucks up within 6 inches in the middle of the night when it's pitch black and make sure that nobody gets hurt, no birds get injured. It is unbelievable sometimes. Whoops. Oh, how about this? Loading birds. Okay. That gentleman on the right, we spend a lot of time encouraging people that sometimes less is more. You don't have to be doing this number. Sometimes all you have to do is just hang that flag and walk gently, and you can move birds along. And that's just that slow, easy communication with the bird and with your employee. Labor that is constantly turning over and getting them to appreciate what it's like to work with animals, especially individuals who haven't grown up with animals. Those of you who have livestock understand what I mean when I say less is more. And sometimes slower is faster. How about transportation down the road? We all know that things are a little different now climatically. especially if you live in Florida and you're still trying to recover your belongings from underwater. So how are we going to deal with a world where there are a lot more days that are over 100 degrees, or freak days in the middle of winter that are freezing cold? Is this enough to keep birds comfortable going down the road? We actually are spending a lot of time looking at what's really going on in these trailers. And what else can we do? Or the converse, what do we do here in Arkansas? I was looking at a blurb the other day where it said we're sort of in a belt in the Midwest where it's gonna, our days that are above average temperature-wise are gonna go up. We're gonna have more of those days. How are we gonna keep these birds cool in the middle of summer? Well, that's one answer. That's our fan trailer, by the way. And it looks like that when we're loading birds and it's hot. And the first bird on has to sit for about 45 minutes before that truck starts moving. How are you going to keep them cool? Well, that's what you do. That's what you do. That's one of our success stories, we like to think. Okay, processing wing breaks. And Paco, you did a wonderful job in going through this, so I don't really need to show slides of what constitutes a wing break. But one of our challenges here is loading birds during the daylight. As you're moving birds to a doorway through which light is shining, that's not always the easiest thing to do. It's a lot easier at night. How do we do this safely and effectively when we're loading birds during the day? We're constantly trying to figure that one out and come up with innovative ways to handle this. Cannibalism, that's a constant source. As we have gotten better at dealing with infectious diseases, and we have, our barns have gotten better. The problems that I struggled with when I came here back in 2006, I don't deal with a lot of those problems anymore, but I deal with different problems, one of which is cannibalism. And so we put a fair bit of attention into working with our lighting. Whoops. This is an example of one of our barns that we can control, not only the length of time that lights are on, but also the intensity of the lighting. And we're looking to see what happens as we vary the intensity of light and its impact on the bird and their behavior, as well as on their performance. And certainly that's something that Dr. Weimer and I are looking at over the next year or so, is how can we impact this flock in a positive manner by manipulating their lighting? Now, unfortunately, we've got a lot of legacy barns that have curtain sides. We're at the mercy of ambient light. And obviously we're trying to, I showed you this picture before, we're trying to minimize this risk. Enrichment. So one of the things we're figuring out is that you have to have several alternatives. One option is not going to do it because you've got to rotate your interventions. And it might be a bale of hay. It might be what we call our blocks. And I'll show you that in a second. Or it might be a water additive, baking soda, for example. Now, this is an example of our block. It's just a seed vitamin combination with some molasses in there. And when we put these in the barn, so it looks like that, we consider this to be an enrichment device. And the birds actually spend a fair bit of time pecking on this. And it seems to break that cycle of them wanting to cannibalize each other. And so we've leaned fairly heavily on these when we see a problem developing. And it's actually turned into be a very useful tool. in our box. We're still working on the best way to present this. So we're working on, can we hang them? Does that make it better? How do we position it? How many do we need? Those kinds of things. Automation. Once again, when the generation that came before me, Dr. Weimer, departs, what are we going to see coming into our barns? And how will this impact the bird? So something like this. We're actually trying one of these devices to encourage birds. So it's very slowly goes around the barn and just encourages birds to get up and walk. In part because as we automate barns, people are less likely to go into barns. I'm old enough to believe that you got to spend time in your barns, but that doesn't always happen. I'd rather have a human in the barn than this, but the reality is folks don't want to do that anymore, whether I like it or not. How are some of these tools going to help us, and what's the impact? We're looking at them, but I don't have the answer for that yet. Labor, I keep talking about labor all the time. We struggle. Everybody's struggling in this economy with getting labor. Continuous turnover and training. Spend a lot of time on this, and that's our commitment. Before anybody handles birds, they have to be trained. That's sort of the basic anymore. Making this happen, given the constant turnover, is tough. And making sure that everybody understands what the expectations are. This is basic stuff, but it's what keeps me up at night. Making sure everybody understands what we want from them. So this one I struggle with. We get challenged with multiple criteria for or expectations for how we handle our birds. And at the end of the day, those of us in operations management, we have to have one program that we can then sell to 500 plus growers. I can't have 2 or 3 different programs. I got to have one program, and everybody's got to do it thoroughly and consistently. And I struggle with that because sometimes I get multiple things coming at me. And so every year as we change off our customer base and switch over customer groups, there are times where I have different expectations from one year to the next. And I've got to quickly regroup and change our training to make sure everybody understands what we're doing. One such thing is the trend to raise birds that are antibiotic free. Now, if you're a company that has both a conventional and an antibiotic free set of farms, then it is not a major problem if a flock that is designated to be antibiotic free gets sick and has to be treated. They merely switch to conventional. But if an entire complex is antibiotic free, what happens? And as a veterinarian, I struggle with that. I struggle with when a flock should be treated because those birds are suffering, but they're designated as antibiotic free. What do we do? And that answer, I don't think we as an industry, we as a group, have come down conclusively one way or another. I visited with a producer who was an antibiotic-free individual, and he said, well, my birds they never get sick. And, okay. The law of averages would dictate that at some point in time, that may not be. But I struggle with that. I struggle with that one, and we will switch antibiotic-free flocks from that category to conventional when necessary. And those are all the individuals that work with me that in each of our complexes that fight the good fight every day in making all this happen. This is our world. It's what we live on. It sounds simple, but it's a daily struggle to make it all happen. Questions?
Questions for our speaker?
Come on, guys. There's got to be
Good.
one.
I have a bunch of questions, so if other people don't have any, I can ask a bunch. So my first question was around the sort of the culling euthanasia decision making. I was wondering how common it is to use hospital pens and what your experience is with those.
So when I see hospital pens, they have to be managed. That's the problem. If you're going to put up a hospital pen, you got to manage it. And I think I probably lean towards not having hospital pens, merely because manage the main body, the barn, correctly, and euthanize the birds that need to be euthanized. Because I see when I dilute the efforts of a grower, it can sometimes get complicated for the wrong grower. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I'm learning as I get older, keep things as simple as I can. It'll minimize risk. Is that it?
Someone else.
So my question, you use the term legacy a lot. Would you say you're a legacy veterinarian?
I'm a legacy veterinarian. I am definitely a legacy veterinarian.
No, but okay, a real question. It seems like you're dealing with cannibalism a lot in your hen flocks. Has that increased in incidence in your legacy of veterinarian, or has it come in phases? What are your notes on that?
So I think my sense is that as we have fixed problems, and I'm talking about clinical problems, so intestinal problems, as those have receded in terms of getting my attention, then some of these other problems that may have been minor, relatively speaking, have risen to the top. So it's very interesting because I deal with a group of growers here in Arkansas who didn't know what it was like 15 years ago. And their expectations in terms of growing turkeys has changed, has evolved. I'm sorry, it hasn't evolved. They never knew what it was like 15 years ago. And so the cannibalism that we see is surprising to them and disturbing. And so we've had to come up with suggestions and ways to deal with this. But I don't think that cannibalism is new, certainly not new. Is it more severe now than it was 15 years ago? I think 15 years ago, we were dealing with birds dying versus birds being cannibalized today. I think it existed back then, certainly. It just wasn't at the top. Other questions?
Hi, so I work for Cobb Vantress, and so obviously, like you mentioned, labor shortages and turnover being, a really big challenge, especially lately. And I think, something that I've kind of noticed is it does seem to be, that has been a really significant animal welfare challenge in terms of keeping people, trained, but then also keeping people, making sure that they understand and are properly euthanizing. But another thing that I have noticed is I feel like a large welfare challenge comes in when you have too little labor and too much work to be done. And then you're going to get people starting to cut corners and try to shorten that. Well, how have you guys, or could you kind of give me an idea of how you've managed Like, how do you manage through that labor shortage and ensure that your animal welfare standards are being met?
So it's interesting. I've worked for 3 companies now. And back when I started, I worked with company farms where we had hired employees. And that situation is very challenging. Now, I very rarely deal with company farms. They're all contract farms. And they are mostly smaller family farms designed in such a way that a family unit can deal with the work demands. So I think that's one way that we skirt that issue. But there's no doubt that there are some farms that are larger, maybe not as large as a broiler farm, but larger. And I know that we are seeing more all-in, all-out units for turkeys. Nothing new for broilers, but for turkeys, that's new. And what that does is it spreads out the work demands so that you don't have this continuous rotation that requires a tremendous amount of labor every few weeks. And so what we're seeing is that, once again, as our grower base gets older, they're actually happier having more time with an all-in, all-out situation. Now, I don't mean to imply that all of our production is that way, but that is the trend, certainly. We're seeing, I would say, all of our new farms in Arkansas are all in, all out. And I have seen a shift, and help me, Eric, we have gone from 95% two-stage, and in 3 years shifted to 90% all in, all out. 90-something%. And so growers are actually happier with the spreading out of the labor requirement. There's downtime where there's no birds. They can actually go on vacation and don't have to worry about birds on the farm. So there are some benefits now. It's an ongoing work. And we don't have all the answers. There's still two-stage farms out there. But we're going to have to deal with this labor shortage, or just a labor force that does not want to do the kinds of things that 20 years ago we did. Fair enough? Other questions? Don't be shy, folks.
I have a question over here.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello. So I'm not familiar with that yellow device, the Sputnik.
Mhm.
What can you explain what that does?
Yeah, so basically it'll trundle around the barn, and we're using it to encourage our hens to get up and move around. So it doesn't scare them. It goes very slowly. And it helps to get them up and keep them moving around, because we all know that activity on the floor is a positive thing, as opposed to them sitting around and getting broody all day long, for example. And so very slowly it encourages those birds to get up. They can go to the feed line, those kinds of behaviors. That's just one example of an automated tool that we're looking at to see, what will help us in these barns of the future. Other questions?
Yes, we have one online here. Ruth Newberry, nice to see the pecking blocks. What about providing places with attractive dust bathing materials as another enrichment? This would improve the cleanliness and feather condition of the birds.
So we are going one step at a time. I've given you guys sort of a snapshot into my world and the things that we're looking at, the things that we perceive to be our challenges and how we're trying to address them, whether it's euthanasia, barn design, barn tools, things like the pecking blocks, I think what Cargill has done is we have an advisory board that meets annually that helps us to anticipate what types of expectations are coming down the pike and ways that we can meet those challenges. And certainly, as we evaluate, do we need perches? Do we need dust baths? Do we need windows? What is scientifically proven to give these birds a better quality of life? And I think as we start to understand what actually matters for a bird, I think very slowly you will see us move that way. Other questions?
One more.
How does your antibiotic-free demand compare to conventional? Are you seeing changes? Stagnant? What could you speak to that?
The question was for the online visitors, what's
Demand for
what's your customer demand for antibiotic free?
So I would say that it is there. It is growing slowly, but there's still a huge demand for conventional meat. What would you say our Big Tom antibiotic-free breakdown is now? 30% of our Big Tom in Butterfield? So maybe 30% of our Big Toms in one complex are antibiotic-free. And we're probably 85% success, something like that. How are we in hens? What's our success rate on ABF?
Probably say 90.
So, I'm sorry?
What does success mean?
No antibiotics. So we don't have to divert anything, right? And so, I think that's come about because improvements in our buildings, our barn designs, changes in management, a commitment to doing it. Great. It hasn't taken us by storm. It's not as though we're going to go 100%. But I have seen it grow certainly in the last 5 years. It's I have seen this shift in mentality, right? To where it's a lot of fun to grow our birds. It has been a very different world today than it was 20 years ago. That's for sure. Other questions?
Right on time.
All right.
All right, now it's time for a break. Thank you to those that have been in the long haul with us all day. We will take a short break and then finish up with our last two speakers. And we'll come back at 1:45.